The story of the modern Middle East begins in the 600s with the rise of Islam. Out of the context of the Byzantine, Sassanid, and Gupta empires, three large agricultural centralized states governed much of this territory. However, in the 500s, as the Byzantine Empire took on the mantle of the Roman Empire, a rivalry developed between the Byzantines and the Sassanids, and in this context, eventually war developed. The wars of the 570s and 580s ripped apart the region, and areas within Arabia began to experience a brief respite from imperial rule. And in that context is from where Islam emerges. So we might call this the rise of Islam period. During the lifetime of Muhammad, roughly 570 to 632, although Muhammad was active from 583 to 632, and after Muhammad dies, a group of people called the caliphs, the khalifas, the successors to Muhammad, what Sunnis call the Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs, who were elected, they begin to govern the Middle East. However, there are many different views of who should be caliph and how the caliph should be chosen. And there's a major split that occurs, which has become well pronounced today in the modern context. And that is the Sunni and Shiite split. Although there's other splits as well, this is perhaps the main one. The other major takeaway is that the concept of the Middle East really emerges in this period. And as you can see here, that there will be other people who will eventually rule this territory as a part of a large Muslim empire. So this territory you see in blue is the territory that comes into the Islamic empire or domains around the time from Muhammad's death until the 660s. And then beyond that, you can see the expansion of Islam in the late 600s into the early 700s, as far away as places like India, Pakistan, and off the map here, which you will see in a few moments, Spain. This eventually connects a huge swath of territory, from modern Spain and Portugal, throughout North Africa, throughout the modern Middle East, Arabia, into Central Asia, and into South Asia. At the center of this were numerous peoples of the former Sassanid and Byzantine empires. But perhaps more importantly, there's a massive amount of wealth that's acquired by the early Muslim rulers. Because, as you can see here, the majority of major trade routes, with the exception of Constantinople, which is ruled by the Byzantines, are under the control or influence of Muslim powers. And so a massive amount of wealth comes in to this area. Aside from the massive amount of wealth gained through trade, one of the other important factors of early Muslim rule in the Middle East is that the majority of people are not Muslims. The majority of people are non-Muslims, well into the 900s and perhaps into the 1000s. As a result of that, Muslim powers collect a special tax, what they call jizya or jizye, which we'll talk about in class, which they get from non-Muslims, principally Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians. So, coupled with the amount of trade and this special tax, these Muslim rulers become incredibly wealthy and dominate the known world from what is now what we call Europe to China for over 2 decades. One of the main moments and one of the main concepts to take away from this time in Islamic history is the split between Sunni and Shiism. Here we can see a modern depiction of the martyrdom of Hussein. Hussein was the son of one of the caliphs, the rightly guided caliphs, called Ali. Hussein died in a battle of Karbala, fighting against the forces of the Umayyads. And so this is one of the beginning moments where slowly, not dramatically, but slowly, Sunnism and Shiism begin to drift. The Battle of Karbala is still remembered in the month of Muharram as this time of martyrdom. And there's a great commonality one can see with the Shiite celebration of Muharram and the Passion Play, for example, in Roman Catholicism. There's a lot of sights, there's a lot of sounds and remembrance. But the emphasis here, at least the modern emphasis on the death of Hussein, is on martyrdom. That being said, the Sunni and Shiite split develops over a long period of time and doesn't happen immediately. That, despite those sort of the slow shift, the monuments to these martyrs are built, and this is an example of that. This is the mosque here at Karbala in Iraq. Two dynasties take over after the death of Muhammad. The Umayyads, who I mentioned previously, from 661 until 750, and they're eventually overthrown by the group we see here, the Abbasids, from 750 until about 1250, although others of them go on later. This is during the reign of Harun al-Rashid, which is one of the cultural and literary high points of Abbasid rule. And here you can see the core of the empire is what is now Central Asia, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Arabia, what many people consider the core of the Middle East. And in this way, the notion of the Middle East, at least in part, is born. And again, we can see the core of the Middle East here in the darker blue and gray, as opposed to the fringes of it or the conception of it in the lighter blue. By the 900s, the Abbasid Caliphate had lost a degree of its importance through internal division as well as external threats. If you look over to your far left, you can see the Umayyads take up residence in Spain. There's a group called the Samanids in Central Asia, and there's a new Shiite dynasty in North Africa called the Fatimids, as well as the Byzantines will challenge the Abbasids. Eventually, the Abbasids themselves, you can see here under the red area called Buwayyids or Buwayyids, are governed by various sort of warlords. And so warlords and local dynasty, as with any other empire, eventually take over, and you have a very politically divided region. So although the Abbasids have a great degree of political and religious authority, they have lost some, and the idea of a unified Islamic territory, which has existed from the 650s at least until the 900s, now is gone, and local competitors battle for the mantle of who gets to be in charge. That takes us to about the year 1000, on the very edge of the Crusades. You can see here the Fatimids and the Shiites have exerted themselves, the Byzantines have expanded, and any sort of mention here on the map of the Abbasids is gone. And so the political events within the region have created a great deal of diversity. So to sort of get a summary of this, we have the Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs who take over after Muhammad. We have the Umayyads, who were hereditary. They sort of succeeded one or another. We have the Abbasids, who overthrow the Umayyads, who then become hereditary. And then by the year 1000 and into the 1300s, we have the arrival of new groups. So around this year 1000 period, there's the arrival of the Crusaders from Western Europe and from the Mediterranean, and from East Asia and Central Asia, the Mongols. These create even further disruption. So before the arrival of the Crusaders and the Mongols, there was already divisions. And by 1000, there's even greater divisions. This adds another degree of new outside political and economic influence, both Western Europe and the Mediterranean, as well as East Asia. And so as you see here on this PowerPoint slide I put up, from about the 1250s or 1258 to the 1500s, there's all kinds of political division in the Middle East. The period we're going to talk about next time is the emergence, or re-emergence, one might argue, of imperial powers, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and others. And so you can see another up-close example of how really politically divided this region is. And you can see here the territory in the Middle East right before the arrival of the Crusaders. And you can see some of the polities that exist there, as well as here. And these sort of examples of the various groups that are going to come from Central Asia and rule the Middle East. The Crusader states in Western Europe are often celebrated, often spend a lot of time. Modern world history textbooks spend a lot of time talking about them. But in the grand scheme of the Middle East, they're there a rather brief period. all told perhaps 200 years, but really about 100 or 120 years of real intensity. Although it does represent a major sort of moment in the region, it's a rather fleeting one in the grand sort of sweep of history. What replaces the Crusaders are a group called the Ayyubids and the Mongols, who come out of Syria and Egypt and eventually drive the Crusader states out. They create a kind of new legitimacy in the region and add, yet again, a new polity, a new center. So in the past, the caliphal centers were at Damascus and Baghdad, but the new Mamluks and the Ayyubids rule from Egypt, specifically Cairo. Now this world map is meant to show you a very important lesson. These are all the various states in the Middle East and Central Asia, Iran and Southeast Asia that exist in the 1230s and 1240s. And very quickly here, in just a blink of an eye, they're all going to be swallowed up by the Mongols. The world-altering moment of the Mongol conquest creates a great deal of impact in the Middle East. Not only are the Abbasids fundamentally shaken, the Abbasid Caliph is actually captured by the Mongols, rolled up in a carpet, and trampled by horses, killing him, and the Mongols take numerous people, slit their throats, and dump them into the Tigris. This really feels like an apocalyptic moment, because it is. One of the Abbasids' relatives is able to escape to Cairo and take refuge with the Mamluks. But for all intents and purposes, the idea of a unified caliphate is really shattered by the Mongols. Perhaps more importantly, a new ethnic group, the Turks, or Turkic peoples, begin to seep into this region and populate parts of what is now Iran, Central Asia, and what will become Turkey.